Hello, students. This is Dr. Winkler again. We're moving right along. I believe this is lecture number 5. So we're talking about ancient Egypt. And I need to clear my throat here a little bit, so take a shot of water and see if that helps out. We're talking about ancient Egypt. Talking about burials. In other words, we have these nice big mounds, which we call pyramids, where we put corpses. Now, I already mentioned when we were talking about the circle graves and its natural form of mummification, where the corpse is preserved quite well, actually, because in the hot, dry sands has a tendency to withdraw the moisture from the body, so the body doesn't rot in the normal manner, doesn't age in the normal manner. But when you start putting a corpse in a mastaba, where it's a chamber, a room, you put the body in there, there's nothing there to draw the moisture out of the flesh. So it's going to rot. And pretty soon you got a pretty big problem. You have no body at all. So the Egyptians are trying to figure out a way that they can preserve the body. And they work out a program we call mummification. Mummies, I know you're familiar with the old bad jokes. My mummy and my daddy. Well, the mummy is probably from an Arabic term, which largely means bitumen or tar bodies. What happens when corpses are mummified? Very often the flesh turns dark. But the whole idea here is that when the spirit leaves the body, and later on the spirit will come back, the body should be in a state of preservation. So I guess it's more recognizable when you come back. Now, a mummified corpse just doesn't look anything like a living, healthy person by any means. But it's supposed to be closer, shall we say, to what the person would be like than just a bag of bones. Well, let's take a look at this. Mummification is simply a process by which you try to destroy the process of rotting. One of the ways you do this is take moisture out of the body. You simply take salts. You have the corpse laid out, and you put salts all the way around the body. And in doing so, salt, as you know, has a tendency to draw the moisture out. Now, there's another situation, and that's the internal organs. When we are alive, I know I'm being gross. Please excuse me. I should entitle this The Gross Lecture of the Day, and this is very gross. When we're alive, our body simply takes care of, like, for example, the stomach acid. When we die, whatever protection that is goes away. So the stomach acid, which is within our guts, keep on digesting our body. So one of the things you need to do is remove the internal organs. There's an incision made, lower abdomen, where you go in and you pull everything out. I know I'm being gross. You pull out the internal organs, you pull out the heart, you pull out the liver, you pull out the kidneys, the intestines, and everything. And they're usually subject to separate mummification, where you try to get the salt out of them. And they're often put in jars. So I guess when the spirit comes back to the corpse, the spirit will go over and grab the internal organs and reinsert them for the continued function. The heart was given special treatment. The heart was considered to be the seat of emotion and intellect. We do have terms even today. My girlfriend dropped me, and I have a broken heart. In other words, there's a seat of emotion. However, the seat of intellect is a little bit stronger. You see, to us, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because we know that the brain is the seat of intellect. It's actually the seat of emotion as well. The brain was removed. See, how do you remove the brain from a skull? That's a little hard to do. Actually, what they would do is you would go up to the nostrils. There are some fairly thin bones up here near the brain, and you go up there and you get some kind of tools and you kind of drag out. I imagine it comes out in pieces. You have to drag the brain out. It's not given any special treatment. Sometimes the ancient Egyptians believe that if you have a light heart, you have a good soul. Now, a question we have to ask ourselves, and I played high school football, and sure many of you did as well. There's been other times in your life when you get whacked on the head. Now, obviously, isn't there some kind of intellect going on here? Isn't there some kind of way you're being destabilized because you're being here? And when you not therefore think that the higher faculties, thinking and emotions, might be rested here. Well, you can certainly make that argument. I'm sure somebody did back in the ancient world. But have you ever been pumped in the solar plexus? You know, get you in the gut or just below the heart. Well, what happens there? Well, you're a little disoriented. You're a little bit dizzy, and sometimes you pass out. So they can make that argument that the heart is a seat of intellect, even though you and I know better at this time frame. Some of these are several thousand years old. The state of preservation happens to be quite good. If I remember my mummies correctly, this gentleman right here is Ramses II, which we will discuss later on. When we get to Roman times, the people living in Egypt, though many of whom are Romans, and many of the people that were there before the Romans are of Greek descent. I mean, in other words, when Alexander the Great came in, the ruling class and the upper classes are Greek in origin. But what they would do, let's see if I can get one here, and show you what they did. They actually, on top of the corpses, would draw a portrait of the corpse inside there. So I guess when the spirit comes back, it can more readily identify where it's supposed to go. Here we have a relatively elegant woman. Now, we don't have a lot of portraits that are survived from ancient Romans. These are Romans living in Egypt. But we do have these examples. So you don't go to Rome to look at these portraits. You go to Egypt. It's quite interesting. We get a flavor of what kind of people are here. Notice that the ethnicity seems to be somewhat different. Now remember, if you're mummified, that costs money. And if you have a portrait painted of you, and this is probably taken from life because you want to pay for this before it's plopped on your mummy, that you certainly are people of upper class people. So as we look down here at these various people, we do get an idea of there's a wider ethnic variety. I remember one time I was lecturing Egypt in a class, and one student said, well, what were the people like there? And it probably wasn't fair, but what I said was, I said, well, look around this room. You see ethnic diversity in this room, do you not? Well, would you not think that there'd be ethnic diversity also here as well? There is a group of people that, usually in North Africa, we say most of the people there are brown. In dark Africa, is that right? In sub-Saharan Africa, people tend to be black. You go, and the farther north you go, the less black they are, more brown they are. Till finally you get up into Europe, people are white. But as we know, there's a lot of trade going on in Egypt. Egypt's extremely important because it has surplus of crops. One of the reasons why the Romans want to take, because the Romans, they want to take almost everything, right? Even things that aren't terribly valuable. One of the reasons why Romans and Greeks and other people want to take Egypt is it's such a good granary. So you could imagine people are coming literally from all over the Mediterranean and probably areas in much broader areas as well, to come there to live, to administer, and to trade. So the ethnic diversity there is noticeable. In any event, we do have preservation. And sometimes, as you know, the mummies were wrapped in linen. Do you need to go back to one of those? They were wrapped in linen. And that apparently is a small child. They were wrapped in linen, and sometimes the Egyptian officials don't want modern archaeologists, physical anthropologists, to go in and unwrap these things. But there's another way, of course, you can see what's underneath, and that's by the use of x-rays. It's interesting as we look at some of these x-rays. I remember reading about this. There was a person, a pharaoh actually, who had distended, teeth were kind of stuck out a little ways. And why would that be? Well, he was a thumbsucker. When he was a child, I guess they didn't have binkies back then, didn't have the kind of pacifier, and he sucked his thumb. I'll say that right, sucked his thumb. And in sucking his thumb, he distorted his mouth somewhat. So as we look at these people, we do get a sense of they're somewhat like us, are they not? Now, since DNA can be extracted from bones, the best DNA probably comes from a human's teeth. That some physical anthropologists have gone over to Egypt and looked at the DNA to try to get an understanding of actually family relationships when the records are incomplete. So the mummy is quite fascinating. We get an idea of health. We look at some of the mummies and you find out some people have very bad teeth. That's not terribly surprising. Did they even brush their teeth? I kind of doubt that. I'm really, really pleased to live in the modern world because you have modern dentistry, because I don't want to put up with toothaches all the time. Well, anyway, let's move on and talk a little bit more broadly about Egyptian civilization. In this case, let's take a look at the items that were placed with the corpse. Routinely, we say starting about 1500 BC to about 50 BC, until about you get to the Roman times, when the Romans come in. It's very common to have what we call a Book of the Dead, which is buried with the corpse. It's, if you're going to the next life, the netherworld, and waiting for your opportunity to come back to your body, you're going to be met by spirits there, and they're going to ask you questions. I guess it's like the Christian belief that St. Peter will meet you, and St. Peter will judge you, your initial judgment, to see if you go up or down. So the idea in Christianity still does exist. But in the Book of the Dead, we have instructions on what to do, what to say. But there's also statements of what kind of a good person I am. This gives us an idea as to the nature of approved conduct. You're not going to go to the spirit and say, I was a drunk and a lout. I went to Vegas and I gambled away the entire family fortune. You see, that's not part of your ethos. Our ethos is, strong morals. There's ethos is as well. So let's take a look at some of these. Actually, I got these from quotes in German. So these are my translations into English. Hopefully I did a pretty good job. One of the statements is very common. I have done no injustice to anyone. Okay, I've been a pretty good guy. I've insulted no, let's go over here so you can see it. I've insulted no God. Don't insult gods. They don't like that too much. I've caused no tears. That's very nice. I have not killed. Don't commit murder. Cause no tears. What? I've never hurt anybody's feelings. I have lived according to wisdom, which is called Ma'at. I've lived according to wisdom. I have done what pleased the gods, going back. I've insulted no God, but I pleased the gods. I've given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty. Let's keep going here. Clothes to the, a little cumbersome, clothes to the naked, offerings to the gods. I've given bread to the hungry, water to the thirsty. I'm a compassionate person. I'm a person with a pure mouth and pure hands. Now, I would think that not everybody lives up to this ideal. It's probably a pretty good idea maybe to embellish a little bit at various times. But you can see they have a high moral ethic. If you are a wealthy person, you probably want to make sure that this is written out properly. A poorer person, and there's probably scribes that made a living just whacking these things out. And sometimes modern Egyptologists take a look at these, say, yeah, it's a little hard to read because the figures weren't made as carefully as perhaps they should have been. But of all the documents, we find in ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead is by far the most common. We have other moral teachings. How's your Egyptian? My Egyptian's lousy. I actually don't think the T is pronounced in this case. So rather than call these precepts of Ptahhotep, I think it's precepts of Ptahhotep. Fifth dynasty is very early. Remember, there are, 32 dynasties. Some of the dynasties are longer than others. The fifth dynasty is actually in the Old Kingdom, so this is very old. So we think about 2400 BC. This is a little bit different than the Book of the Dead. In the Book of the Dead, you are stating you're a good guy after death. You've done all these things to shall we say, gain favor with the spirits. They're letting you go in and rest or whatever you do until you can come back to your body. It's, as we read this, I was actually somewhat surprised. In the Bible, we have a book called Proverbs. It's called the Book of Proverbs. And it's statements about what kind of person you should be. They say things like, be loyal to your wife, be good to people, be generous, be kind, and that kind of things. It's statements of morality. As we read, however, the precepts of Ptahhotep, it sounds somewhat similar. Now, this is essentially like the kind of thing that a father might say to a son. My dad never did this to me, but people do. I guess this happens. People sit down and say, look, kid, this is how you conduct yourself. Anyway, let's look at these. Beware of consorting with women. Gentlemen, be careful. Got to be careful about women. Be careful with consorting with women. I think it's implying with women to whom you're not married. Provide for, let's get over here. Provide for thine house. Yeah, okay, be a good provider. Get a job. I know your boss is obnoxious. I know your wages are low. But you need to provide for your family. And love thy wife that is in thine arms. Once again, it sounds like Proverbs. This also sounds like Proverbs. Silence is more profitable to thee than abundance of speech. If you're in a conversation, a group of people, and you have somebody who's talking all the time, that person can dominate the conversation very easily. Sometimes, however, the person over here who's been silent, when that person does say something, it can somehow have more effect. Can we say silent people, or tend to be silent when they do speak, do have a tendency to have a little bit more impact per word, shall we say, than somebody just chatting all the time. In saying that my father never sat me down and said, there is no what you ought to do kind of thing. I guess he figured I would learn my morality in another manner. But he did say one thing, it's kind of similar to this. He says, it is better to be, my dad said this to me, it is better to be silent and have people think you're a fool than to speak and remove all doubt. Now, I don't think he made that up, but I always thought it was kind of a cute joke. Silence more profitable to thee than abundance of speech. If thou be powerful, make thyself honored for knowledge. Come to university, take a class, get a degree. Yeah. Power? Sure. Now you're an educated person. People pay more attention to educated people. You should move up in your occupation as well. So, thou be powerful, make thyself to be honored for knowledge. And go back over again. I guess I should have had this in a different size print, but I want you to be able to see it. Make thyself, let me do it again. Make thyself honored for knowledge and for gentleness. Now, this is good advice. Now, let's take a look at writing. I talked a little bit about writing when I was talking about cuneiform, the development of a system of writing which we associate with Mesopotamia. Writing is somewhat different in Egypt. We start out with hieroglyphics. I'm sure you're familiar with hieroglyphics. Before hieroglyphics was broken, in other words, before we could read it, many scholars were looking at this and seeing that you see birds, see a guy down here on his knees, a few snakes, birds up here. We have birds here, guys sitting here. You see, we have what appears to be pictographs. And some of the early people trying to decipher this language looked at this and says, we have to understand the pictographs, and then we can understand the language. However, these are not pictographs. They are symbols and letters. Now, sometimes, and I don't have a good example here, sometimes if you have let's say you have a statement here, you've written it out, a man is walking. And do we have a man walking here? Don't see one very easily. And you've written this out, but then you have a picture, a symbol of somebody walking, like a guy with his legs going out there. So sometimes the symbol has a tendency to help you understand the letters. Now, I want to tell you this is not an alphabet. It's not an alphabet. An alphabet, as you know, is a restricted number of signs. They carry meanings of sound. This, if you're looking at the number of letters, they're hundreds. And you can have numerous symbols that carry the same sound. You can see how complex of a system this would be. I can see over here something, as for some of the letters are used here. Notice that W doesn't, it's a bird, right? Probably it's that kind of bird. You have another kind of bird for M down here. Different kind of snake. I don't know, I just think these things are cool. Many years ago, I read a book by Wallace Budge, written like 100 years ago, about deciphering the Egyptian language. Now, I can't read Egyptian at all. Please do not give me credit, because credit is not due in this case. But I thought it was so cool, the different kinds of things that you use to make different sounds. So this is a pretty complete alphabet. Well, it's not an alphabet. Pretty complete sound system, which we're seeing here. Because people are looking at this and seeing that there are symbols that are just a hand and a lion and a snake or whatever, they had to make the leap of thinking that these were in fact letters, and many of them are. Now, I talked about, when we talk about cuneiform, about Mesopotamia, there is a development. We see simple memory aids in Mesopotamia that become more complex. Remember, I said you go to ideograms and eventually to syllables. Apparently, this does not really happen in ancient Egypt. What we see in ancient Egypt is a full-blown writing system. Now, initially we could say, well, okay, we see a full-blown writing system, but they obviously did develop from pictographs. In reality, we don't have the developmental forms. about 3100 BC, it just kind of appears. And it's a full-blown system. Remember, I was telling you just a lecture or two ago about the question about which is older, Egypt or Mesopotamia. And remember I said I'm a traditionalist. I still think Mesopotamia is probably older as a civilization. But however, we find writing very early in Egypt as well. What has been found are jars. Remember, pottery is a pretty good taproot in what civilizations are doing. And in these jars, there's grain or whatever. In these jars, they had I'm saying this all wrong. There's a seal on the mouth of the jar. And simply they impressed something on there because originally it was clay. You put on the seal, you would put on the jar, you'd put a seal. And it just simply is a statement where this came from. This was probably a tribute to a leader, a ruler, or maybe even a pharaoh. And you sending this, and of course you want to have an account. You don't want to have this leader who controls armies saying, wait a minute, these people down here are late on their payments. We want to make sure that in fact you're getting the right payments. So you put where this is from. It's completely mature hieroglyphics. So it's very old. Well, how would we, remember there's more than one theory about this, but how would we describe that you simply have a full-blown writing system? Now we know that there's contact between the people in Egypt and people in Mesopotamia. It's not that far away. There's trade going back and forth. Maybe, just maybe, the people down in Egypt are seeing what they're doing on clay tablets up in Mesopotamia, and they're going, the symbol there means words, right? Yeah, the symbol there means ideas. Yeah. Maybe somebody down in Egypt said, we can do that, but why should we do what they're doing? Let's do our own thing here. And let's have something that's artistically pleasing on the side as well. That's possible. It could have been simply invented. We have a modern example, at least in the 19th century, when a man by the name of Sequoyah, also known as George Guess, was a Cherokee. Well, he's probably more white than Cherokee, but he was raised as a Cherokee. And he saw that white people use symbols to mean sounds. So he created the Cherokee alphabet. He couldn't read or write, but he sat down and figured that out. So we have Cherokee writing as an example. That kind of thing can be done. Is this done in ancient Egypt? I'm sorry, this is speculation. It could have been that somebody, without even thinking about what's going on in Mesopotamia, sat down and said, we got to figure out a better way of recording things, and sat down and created this system. That's possible as well. But I think it's much more likely that whichever person or persons who worked this out, that they did so with the inspiration of knowing that it's possible, it's a good idea. Well, you can imagine if you're writing a Book of the Dead, for example. Should I show you a Book of the Dead? And so I'm going to show you some writing. Of course, you have people doing various things here. Notice there's writing along the side. Now, if you got all day and a lot of money, you can, just a better one, maybe a little bit better. If you are got a lot of time, a lot of money, this makes some sense. But if you want to have a document that's easy to read, and you can write relatively rapidly, writing hieroglyphics becomes a problem. So we get shortened versions. One is hieratic. I don't know Egyptian and I don't know hieratic. But as we look at that, does that look a little bit more like a cursive? Something that's a little bit easier to read? Yeah. I would hesitate to make a direct comparison between hieroglyphics and this. But wait a minute, I do have something here maybe I can show you. And I wish I could get a little larger view of that. And here we are, gone to a website. But can you see from looking at this that we do have, and there's, I guess that's a hawk, and I guess that's a hawk. Okay, the snake is snake, that's not too tough. I can kind of make that out. And this foot or lower leg or whatever that is becomes something that you and I would think is somewhat like an L. So this is a shortened version. You can write it much more rapidly. And there's also Demotic, which apparently is a shortened version yet of Hieratic. Is that going to help us here a little bit? Hieroglyphics. Hieratisch, this is German, of course. But you can see how sometimes a simplified writing system can develop over time. So there's more than one script actually being used in Egypt. The reason why we have the Egyptologists can read this is the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone was found in Rosetta, Egypt. Ta-da! And by the French soldiers, when Napoleon invaded Egypt, he took an army down there. One of the reasons why he's trying to take Egypt is to find out a way of hurting British interests. So he's by cutting off their trade routes between India. Well, he goes down, he fights battles. Napoleon's very good at that. However, he brought scientists, and they made etchings, very important etchings of representations of monuments and structures, many of which do not exist anymore. Had his men not done this, our knowledge would be much more meager of ancient Egypt. When these men came back to France years later, they published these in large volumes, and they're treasure troves for Egyptologists. Well, the Rosetta Stone is in the British Museum in London. I've seen it. Very impressive. Very impressive. I'd like to get a closer view of it. Anyway, I'm sure you're familiar with what it is. We have hieroglyphics. Is it hieratic? We have two writing systems here. And down here we have Greek. Modern scholars, of course, can read Greek. And how can you equate this with that? Let me make sure I'm telling you correctly. Okay. Okay, Rosetta Stone. Well, that's a website to learn language. Anyway, so a Frenchman, Champollion, got a facsimile, a copy of this, and he saw down here names. We know their names now, but we saw boxes. We call them cartouche, where there are these symbols there, and then they're in a circle. And maybe I'm wasting too much time looking for this. Yeah, I'm probably barking up the wrong tree here. Anyway, what he did is he found name. We know their names. He found symbols in a circle. And he thought, well, if that's a name, it's got to have a number of suppositions. If that's a name, it ought to be a prominent name. So he looks up here and goes, there's a prominent name up here. One is Ptolemy, spelled with a P, Ptolemy, which is, excuse me, you saw it here. I'm doing this backwards. Let me start over again. The Greek's down here. So he saw the cartouche up here. And it's circled, so he thinks it's important. So he looks for important names down here when it's Ptolemy. So he just simply matched Ptolemeus with the cartouche up here. And do these coincide? Well, how does he know if he's right or not? There's an obelisk sitting in Paris associated with Cleopatra. And there it is, I've seen it. Unfortunately, being in Paris with rain and pollution, it is weathered somewhat. But Champollion also saw the cartouche there. And he says, well, maybe one of those happens to be named Cleopatra. So he took the letters he had from Ptolemy and combined them, sound for sound, with Cleopatra. And there was some correspondence. But since there were some letters, which in Cleopatra was not found in Ptolemaios, he now had expanded his letters by a few. And it took years, a long time, he finally broke it. And then they also broke the hieratic and demotic. So these are no longer mystery languages. Well, a little bit more about Egyptian history. Remember, I talked about the second intermediate, which is the Hyksos. Hyksos come in, take over. Remember, they have more advanced technology. I mentioned chariots, but they're also using bronze technology. Before this time frame, what you have is copper as a metal in Egypt. Better bows, more accurate, greater distance, and with greater military technology using bronze, chariots and better bows, they conquer. Now, after they are invited to leave, we get some other important people worth mentioning of ancient Egyptians. We're talking about male-dominated society. That's true almost everywhere. Remember, early on, we do find priests and priestesses that are actually doing obeisance to the gods. Later on, women kind of fall out or have a secondary function. So in male-dominated societies, we'll say, women, if you're women, you're just simply out. I think this is worth mentioning. There is a woman named Hatshepsut, and she was one of the wives of a pharaoh. When the pharaoh dies, you usually have a regency. You have somebody, excuse me, if the heir, the next pharaoh, is young, a boy or whatever, you have a regency. Somebody kind of oversees the administration of the society until that child grows up, and then he can take authority. This is commonly done. What is very unusual is to have the regent be a woman. It's almost always a man. It'd be very, 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 very interesting to know precisely how she manipulated this. But she becomes regent. That's unusual. That's quite stunning, actually. But what is really mind-blowing is when the son, when Thutmose III has become an adult, she is still essentially ruling Egypt. Now, normally we think that, can we say, the most macho of all occupations, the most macho of all human activities is to serve in the military. We would say, well, maybe Thutmose was a milksop and couldn't even tell a woman what to do. Actually, Thutmose is sometimes called the Egyptian Napoleon, because when he does rule by himself, he's involved in numerous military campaigns up the Nile against the Nubians. So this is not a weakling by any real sense. But even as an adult, Hatshepsut dominates him. She has herself, can I get some here? She has herself, Hatshepsut. She often has herself depicted as a man. Now, anybody in court would know that's not true. But if you are a little bit vague on who she actually is, you might want to, you might be a little bit confused about that. Notice this Hatshepsut figure has a beard. So sometimes she has herself portrayed as a man. What do we know about her reign? She's an able person. She's a good administrator. Got another one, Hatshepsut here. Once again, with a beard. She's an able administrator. She remits taxes. Now, she's not a warrior. She's not going to march various places. But as long as she's alive, she actually controls the state. When she dies, this boy, who should have been ruling for years, he is torqued off and then some. And as we see, some of her inscriptions have been erased. In other words, somebody had got a chisel, and we find, can I show you an example of some of those first been erased? Not quite as clear here. But anyway, somebody got a chisel and taken her off the list of pharaohs. Sometimes we see this in ancient Egypt. One of the reasons why I have a pretty good idea who ruled when is that we have inscriptions on the walls depicting the various pharaohs. And you come to her and you find that they have been chiseled off. Well, obviously, Thutmose III was pretty torqued off about all this. And he very much wanted to get rid of her memory. Well, she's an interesting character. It's too bad, from my estimation, that women did not have greater opportunities to show what they could do. But the social stigma against using a woman in a ruler role was so strong that that really was not possible. Let's talk about Akhenaten. He came to power as Amenhotep IV. Later on, he changed his name to Akhenaten. Akhenaten is a curiosity. Some people, like Sigmund Freud, said he's one of the most significant men who ever lived. Other people say he's not significant in any real sense because what he did not last a long time. In other words, he's a flash in the pan. He's really not that important. Well, let's take a look at him and see what we think about him. Remember, he changed his name from Amenhotep IV to Akhenaten. My Egyptian's terrible, but Akhenaten means something like he who worships Aten. Aten is the sun god. Remember, I said earlier, well, wait a minute. The earlier I said the sun god in Egypt is Ra. See, what Akhenaten had done is not just take an old religion and manipulate it to emphasize something different. In renaming the sun god from Ra to Aten, we can be very strong that he's introducing something new. Remember, the Egyptians are polytheists. They believe in all kinds of different gods. The Nile god, the river gods, the sun gods. And he simply, here we go. I don't know why everybody wants to call me at 9 o'clock in the morning. See if I can get rid of this fast. Hello. Yeah, probably just a telemarketer. Too bad my wife's not up. She could have taken that call. It's a good thing I don't sleep till after 9 a.m. in the morning, or else I'd be pretty upset when they wake me up. I'm really great in getting up early, unfortunately. Anyway, first monotheists. Now, some people want to read the Bible and say, well, the first monotheist is going back quite early in the Bible. Could easily be. But it's hard to date some of the time frames of the Bible. There is a story we read in the Bible, this in Genesis, where Abraham went to Egypt. And we know Abraham's a monotheist. Was he down there at the same time as Akhenaten? We don't know. Could he have gone down there and met Amenhotep IV and told him about the one and only God? I guess that's possible, but the problem is this, that Abraham doesn't worship the sun. The one God of Abraham is not the sun God. It's possible Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, took the idea of the one God and superimposed it on the sun God. In any event, we do see this in ancient Egypt. On the west side of the Nile, that's the abode of the dead. The west side of the Nile is where you find the pyramids. Later on, when they don't build pyramids anymore, and they bury pharaohs in the valleys of the kings, that's also on the west side of the Nile. But as we all know, the sun comes up in the east. So Akhenaten wants to be there to greet the sun when the sun comes up. So he has his temples built on the east side of the Nile. You can imagine in a very hot climate with intense sunlight that having shade would be very nice. His temples are kind of open to the sun. They do have pillars going up, but not as much shade. We have an account, it's extremely interesting, from an emissary coming down from Mesopotamia. And he's torqued off because he's trying to meet with the pharaoh and he's standing out in the sun on a hot day. This is a curiosity, no doubt. But then we get some other interesting things about Akhenaten. He has a wife, he has a couple, 3 wives. His main wife is Nefertiti, or Nefertiri. Sometimes you see it spelled in different ways. And we have images. There is a likeness of her, probably made the same time when she was alive, to give you a pretty good, and gives you a pretty good idea what she looked like. Even by our standards, she's an attractive woman. She looks pretty doggone good. Sometimes relationships, what we know about them, sometimes are relationships of convenience. Sometimes guys marry a bunch of women just because they like a lot of women. Very often you also marry people for political reasons, not because of love. You marry them because you can use this as a means of getting a political strength or political association with other groups of people and sometimes other nations. This is true throughout the time of our discussion, even through the Middle Ages. This is commonly done. But we have the first written, testimony is written, account of love. Akhenaten loves Nefertiri, or Nefertiti. First attested written love. Okay, let's go down here. This is one of the more famous depictions of him. I would like to show you that a little bit bigger. That's a little bit better. Okay, we have, do you realize what we're seeing here? We have a family scene. A family scene? Usually when you see pharaohs depicted in art, they're depicted quite differently. It's there, but I want a big one. Okay, and you see the man here? Man, that's the dude. Whoa, talk about a build. This guy spends time in the gym. He's big, he's tall, he's handsome, he's doing masculine things. You can't really see it here, but he's underneath his feet, he's crushing these are sea peoples invading. We will mention them later. He's crushing these people. This is how you see guys depicted. It's how they want to be remembered. And you compare that with that. It's a family scene. It's not machismo. Notice what we have. He had, was it 4 daughters, 6 daughters? And we have a daughter sitting on mom's lap. I think that's mom over here. Mom's lap and holding another one. A family scene. What's he doing over here? He's kissing the baby. Family scene? Absolutely. Realism in art, I have that down here. He doesn't like war. This actually doesn't do him much good in the army because he cuts their budgets. It's very dangerous if the army doesn't like you because sometimes they can be a force which destabilizes your government. But to a certain extent, he's a pacifist. Doesn't want to fight. Realism in art. Okay. Morality, I guess kissing the baby is morals. And there is another aspect of morality. You see, once again, I talked about this just a few minutes ago when I was discussing the Book of the Dead. You say good things about yourself. It shows you something about the mores in society. How do we know what Akhenaten's mores were? Because he praises the sun god, Aten. He praises the sun god. And in doing so, he praises the god according to the god's attributes. If you're praising a god of war, wouldn't you say, oh, you smash your enemies and run over them and you take people down? But if you're talking about Aten, oh, wonderful Aten, you are moral, you are decent, you support the people, you believe in peace. Is it too wide or too wild to suggest that there seems to be a tendency that when you have a monotheist religion, that in fact you do have tendency to have a religion based more strongly on morals? The Hebrews, Christians, the Muslims? Perhaps. Now, let's try to understand him a little bit more. So I can go back to some representations of him. Let's take a look at Akhenaten. I would like to give you kind of a full body view. Maybe that works a little bit better, a little bit bigger. Does that look like a normal guy? Some people say he had water on the brain, hydrocephalic, or whatever that means. He looks like his hips look a little bit more like feminine hips than masculine hips. They appear to. Some people have speculated, take a look at him, and say, well, how many times did pharaohs marry members of the family? Can we say there's a little inbreeding here? I guess that's possible. Some people had suggested for a long time that in reality, since Aten is without gender, remember, usually gods are male. Even single gods are male. So I say monotheist, one god, usually the god is male. But if Aten has both feminine and masculine attributes, should he not be depicted as having both feminine and masculine attributes? That happens to be fairly good theory. Now, we know that he was overthrown. And in all likelihood, his corpse was not mummified. Let me tell you a story. This is quite shocking to me. I am not an Egyptologist, but I try to follow articles and newspaper reports, what's coming out about what's happening in Egypt. I had never ran across any statement, book, or article that it said they'd found the corpse of Akhenaten. However, I'm in New York, love New York, gotta go to New York. He's gotta go to New York. Wonderful. Hanging around Times Square, and there's a museum near Times Square. I didn't know much about it. They just simply said, Egypt exhibition. Shazam. They're going to pass up on that. It costs like $44. I don't go cheap. I'm a cheap man, but I don't go cheap on traveling. This might be my once in a lifetime chance. So I paid the bucks. I went in, and they claimed they have found the corpse of Akhenaten. Was not mummified. In other words, we're talking about bones. And in examining the bones, we find out that he did look like that. And let's see if I can get you his skull. Okay. Notice in the other, I've already taken it down. Notice that we have examples of the head protruding out back in this direction. As we look at his bones, guess what? It does protrude. If you look at him, kind of gross, right? As we look at him face on, his head does look a little bit more extended. So actually, he's probably represented fairly accurately in art. To say I was fascinated by this and dazzled by this would be an understatement. Whoa, it takes a very, very big leap in our understanding now of what this guy was really like. Well, he's overthrown. The priests who were in the old religion lost their job. They're pretty upset. They'd like their job back. The men in the military, one of his Horemheb, who actually ends up being Pharaoh, a couple of steps removed. The keeper of the horse probably didn't like him very much. And that's the reason probably why he was discarded. The person who rules after him is Tutankhamun, King Tut. And we find that King Tut didn't rule very long. He dies, 20 years of age. He's quite young. And we find that his burial chamber was fantastic. It's entirely possible that what we see in his burial chamber was actually what it should have been in Akhenaten's. He does not leave a huge mark on religion or on morality. That's why maybe we can say he's a flash in the pan. But he's a very, very interesting one nonetheless. Let's talk about Ramses. Ramses II. This guy has an extremely long rule. A builder, a very large percentage of the monuments we have from the New Kingdom actually come from him. Let's get Ramses II up here. He don't look so good anymore, right? That's his corpse. They have found it. He was mummified, as you can see. It's not just a bag of bones. His flesh is actually there. Reigns for a very lengthy period of time. He's famous as a builder. A lot of the monuments are associated with him. Let's see. Let's go to Abu Simbel. One of the more spectacular monuments which he had created is Abu Simbel. Abu Simbel, can we get him on a map? I want him on a map. That's where I was at before. Let's try it this way. Okay. Abu Simbel, as you can see, is down here. Now, this was about the length of the New Kingdom. And what you want is people coming down the Nile, remember, in this direction. He wants people to see that you're entering Egypt. And he wants people to be impressed. And I'm sure this is very, very, very impressive. You want people to be impressed. You're entering the kingdom. This is power. And he has Abu Simbel, which has these 4 figures, all of which representing him. You might as well have yourself duplicated here. One of these has fallen down, and it is a spectacular temple. One of the reasons why I want to mention this is that when they built the Aswan Dam, you can see there's water right here, they realized as the water backed up in the Nile, it's going to cover this up. And there can be a loss. This is going to be underwater. Unfortunately, when they built the first Aswan Dam, they didn't make nearly as many precautions. As the water backed up in the Nile, it covered monuments and temples, which are completely lost. Well, they didn't want to lose this one. So in the 50s, early 60s, there was an attempt to save this. Well, how are you going to save that from water? Using, so obviously some pretty good technology. What they did was they simply cut it up using very narrow blades. And then they got jacks underneath it and raised it so it would be at a higher level than the reservoir coming from the Aswan Dam. So I've never been to Egypt. I urge you all to go, and you can come back and tell me about it, and I will be dazzled by your fantastic experience. But if you go there and see this, you realize that it is actually the level where it's at now is not the level where it was originally. It has been saved. In quite a brilliant engineering feat, they raised it and was able to save it. There's a temple near Luxor in Egypt called Karnak. I don't have it on here, do I? But I should have mentioned it. This is a temple, and it was worked on for a lengthy period of time. I'm not going to say that Ramses II started it, and I'm not going to say he completed it, but I'm going to say he extended it. And this is another building mystery, if you will. These columns, is that a good picture of the columns? You can kind of see they're in stones. And the stones are about 20 tons each. Now, using the technology that was available to them at the time, how are you going to get a stone from ground level up to the top of these columns? I can't remember the exact height. Would you guess maybe 80 feet, 60 feet? You just don't have cranes. You can't really lift it up. Another example of how on earth could they do these things? One theory is they filled things up with sand or rocks or stone and dragged them across. If it's with sand, it's going to sink in. That's really not going to work. There's problems in almost every way that you could do it. But they're there, like the pyramids are there. Somehow they moved them up. Now, these things were painted. Paint on stone. And remember, there's hieroglyphics here, and hieroglyphics could be painted. So this is a beautiful form of writing. However, over time, the weathering, rains once in a while, the paint has sloughed off. So the effect is not quite the same now as it was then. But these are very good examples of brilliant and monumental structures. Okay. We do see this. Sometimes we see that the great people have to be military conquerors. I mean, if you think about people historically, and we start naming people of importance historically, it seems like military leaders come to mind as often, perhaps more often than anybody else. More often than religious leaders, sometimes more often than leaders of countries. You know, the conqueror. Well, you've got to do this, right? So Ramses extends the Egyptian empire farther than anybody else. And let's get him here. He goes up north and into Syria and fights a people called the Hyksos. I'd like to show you on a map, just give you a good idea. This is the farthest extent the Egyptian empire ever went. Because not only did they conquer what you and I would call Palestine, but they push up into what you and I would call Syria. So you come up here, and the Hittites, which are up here in Turkey, the Anatolian Peninsula, are moving down the same direction. We do have an interesting scenario where you have an account by a battle up here from the Egyptians, and they say they won. You have an account by the Hittites, probably the same battle, and they say they won. I think in the modern world we call this spin doctors, where something happens and you spin it for the positive. And in reality, it was probably a standoff or draw, but both sides spin it in a direction to make themselves look good. Increases slavery? Yeah. We do believe that even if Joseph did not enslave all of Egypt, when he's helping the Hyksos, that slavery became much more common, virtually the norm. Virtually everybody is associated. Everybody who's not at certain economic levels are in fact technically owned by the Pharaoh. He's kind of a weirdo as far as I'm concerned. This man who does so many things militarily and builds so many buildings, people would say he's got a strong ego, or maybe he's got a real weak ego. My God, you got to have your face everywhere. The monument has to be everywhere. My armies have to march everywhere. This is not somebody who feels good about himself. This is probably somebody who doesn't feel good about himself. As sick as it sounds, he had relationships with his daughters. And he had children by his daughters to create what would we say a royal lineage for centuries, maybe 400 years. This family, if you want to call them that, this incest, was considered to be a pretty high group of people within Egypt because they all come from Ramses probably several times over. A question we might want to ask ourselves is, was this the Pharaoh of the Exodus when the Hebrew peoples left Egypt and went into what you and I call Israel or Palestine over here? The Bible says this, that Abraham, where did he come from? Moses and Aaron came to talk to Ramses. It doesn't say which one. Unfortunately for our understanding, the Ramses, there are what, 7, 8 different Ramses? Ramses first counting on up. So it could have been any one of those men because they're really within a couple of centuries. On the other hand, circumstantial evidence would have us think that Ramses II might have been, he'd be the most likely candidate, let's put it this way, of having been the Pharaoh for the Exodus. Which is kind of my little intro now to skip over away from the Egyptians and now start talking about the Hebrews. The Hebrews are not powerful politically in any real sense. They're not powerful economically in any real sense. They're not powerful artistically in any real sense. But can we say among the ancient peoples, they particularly in the long run, are more influential than any other group? Because the Hebrews become Jews, and Christianity springs off from Judaism, and Islam springs off, can we say, even both from Judaism and from Christianity. So, and the impact of these modern religions is really quite stunning. A lot of our ideas of right and wrong, a lot of our ethos, a lot of our ideas of worship, a lot of our ideas of religion go back and have a very strong influence going from the Hebrews. Well, who were the Hebrews? Well, we read in some ancient texts about people called the Habiru. And what do we know about them? They're wanderers and outcasts. They're the kind of people that live out there that people don't like very much. Can we say that the Hebrews and the Habiru are the same people? Maybe. We do know that, however, they were not well received in many cases. Remember reading in the book of Genesis about Joseph who was sold into Egypt. And remember during the famine, his brothers, not knowing who he was, of course, comes down to Egypt. And it was said in the book of Genesis that the Egyptians would not have anything to do with these people. They held them in obeisance. They were people you didn't like, you wouldn't eat dinner with them. So would this fit in this category? Maybe it would. We do know that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt. It'd be more helpful if we had more Egyptian sources on this. There are some inscriptions in ancient Egypt which do indicate there were people living there that had a kind of cloth that was woven that looked somewhat like Hebrew cloth. The same people, we're not quite sure. But the Bible is abundantly clear. These people were slaves in Egypt. They were considered foreigners, and they could be controlled. We hear more about the slavery in Egypt in the book of Exodus in the Bible. Slaves in Egypt. What was it like to be a slave in Egypt? Exodus 1, verse 11. The Egyptians put slave drivers over them to crush their spirits with hard labor. To me, this says an awful lot about the nature of slavery at the time frame. That it was very harsh. Of course, these people would suffer from having their spirits crushed and would long to get out and leave if they possibly could. They do leave. They leave Egypt. We read about a number of slave uprisings. When we talk about Rome, I'll talk about the First and Second Servile Wars. I'll also talk about Spartacus' revolt. So we're going to make mention of this a few times. So we know about some other slave revolts. There's probably a lot that took place that we don't know about. However, as far as we know, this is the only known successful ancient slave revolt where people are actually able to gain their freedom. The Exodus, I've already mentioned the book. Exodus actually means coming out of. So the Exodus goes from Egypt, well, it's too early to call this Palestine or Israel, the land of Canaan, which is really over here. Can I give you a map of the Exodus? Images? Okay, this is good stuff, by the way. Yeah, this is a route by which we think they went. They left Egypt over here. Remember Goshen, where they were at. It's this area right here. And you go down here and Mount Sinai, where Moses went up and received the law on the tablets. And then later on, they go up and enter into Canaan, which you would know later know as Palestine or Israel. Are we running low on time? Oh, we are running low on time. Let me just say a few things, and then I'll go on. When the people move in to Canaan, there are other peoples there. And of course, there's going to be a lot of war initially because these newcomers coming in, they tend to push out the other people. The other people don't like this and they tend to resist. There's a book in the Bible called the Book of Judges, where you have the judges rule over the people. And they're kind of local leaders. And when there's a threat militarily, you get together and get a few people together and go out and conquer somebody. Well, can we say, if you're talking international affairs, this is pretty challenging. If you have a large, well-organized army coming in, you're going to be in big trouble. Then we get the people appealing to the prophet that they're going to create a nation with one king, and the king is King Saul. We believe that he's ruled starting around 1000 BC. Which is about as far as I can take this lecture right now. I appreciate you staying with me. I appreciate you looking past my mispronunciations. And we will continue with this next time. In the meantime, wherever you're doing, continue to enjoy. And I'll talk to you next time.